Hi, perhaps you recognize me. It's your favorite president.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
Anybody in this country doesn't minimize their tax. They want their heads ring.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
The answer is Mike, because I want to do you slowly. I want to do you slowly.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this. If you are watching this live, you can contribute to the discussion today in the chat, or you can click that link to StreamYard if you want to call in and talk to us directly. Ask us a question, have your say. We want to hear from you. Our best episodes are when we have a lot of interaction with our audience, and we love our great audience. So don't be shy, get on there, and we want to hear from you. So let's kick it off like we always do, and that's by letting you know how you can support us, and it's by heading to commandingthenarrative.com, and that is the best way to keep up to date with everything that we're doing. Please don't rely on social media. Head straight to the website. You can get all our previous podcasts. You can get any articles or newsletters that might be up there, and also you can see who's coming up on the podcast this week. If you're interested to get ahead of everyone else to see what's coming up, you can set a time in your calendar or set an alarm for when we go live, and you can keep up to date right there on the website. And while you're there, please hit the sign up button in the top right hand corner to get that regular newsletter. And also, if you would like, please hit the donate button. If you want to donate to us, it helps to pay for the stream, it helps to pay for the website, and most importantly, gives me a very warm and fuzzy feeling inside. Next, I need to let you know about Australians for Better Government. We're kicking a lot of goals with Australians for Better Government at the moment. It is very exciting, this movement that we have created, and I'm going to be speaking to the co-founder of Australians for Better Government today that you all should know and love, Kevin Loughrey. But we've just released this prospectus, which is a very important document that I'll go through in a minute, but also upcoming on the Gold Coast is this event on Sunday, August the 3rd at the CSI Club Southport, right in Southport on the Gold Coast. So if you're near the Gold Coast in Brisbane or Ballina or the Tweed or wherever it might be around the Gold Coast, please come along to this event. We've got some really great speakers. Dr. Christopher Reynolds will be there. He'll also be selling his book, which I encourage you to get a copy of. Senator Malcolm Roberts will be there, and also Senator Jared Rennick. This is going to be an incredible and interesting discussion on shaping the future of Australia's government going forward. And of course, you'll also be hearing from Kevin and myself. So please come along. There's going to be some great raffle prizes on offer as well. So head to australiansforbetter.com and follow the link to get your tickets. They're only about $20 each. So there's no excuse really if you're around the Gold Coast to come along to this event, and we want to see you there. And onto the prospectus. I mean, this is a great achievement, I feel, from Australians for Better Government to be able to put out this document. You can find out what we're all about. It goes through a lot of the reasons why we started Australians for Better Government and the solutions that we want to propose. We might even discuss some of these today. And what you can do is you can download this document and share it out. If you want to spread the word about Australians for Better Government, please share this to everyone that you know, including politicians or media or anything like that. Get it out there so people can learn more about Australians for Better Government. It would be much appreciated. Also, the other initiative that I'm a part of is Let's Rethink Renewables, another important venture. And please head to the website and find out what we're all about at Let's Rethink Renewables. And as you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can also sign up to be a member. It's only $10 a year. So get on board with that. With any of these movements, the more resources that we have, the more members that we have, and the more memberships and even donations that come in, the stronger that these movements will be. So we can really put pressure on these scumbag politicians that we've got in Canberra and in state parliaments that are really doing a bad job at the moment with our system of government and the direction of this country. And that's what we really want to reform. And that's what that we really want to put pressure on them to get their act together. Also, I want to let you know about the Light Australia newspaper. There's a new edition out of the Light Australia, really great edition. So please head to thelighaustralia.com, download the latest copy, or sign up to be a distributor and get the Light out there to everyone. It's a very important initiative. And I also this week spoke to Robin of Courage of the Cure. She's got a big role with the Light Australia newspaper and also with her podcast, Courage is the Cure. Unfortunately, the way that this podcast got out there, it's very pixelated. It's not it's not the best quality for some unknown reason, but the audio is still pretty good. And I talk a lot about Australians for Better Government with Robin. So please head to her channel, support her, and check out that podcast and what I had to say there. But today I've got Kevin back on the show, and like we often do, we think about what we're going to talk about, any big topics that we would like to discuss. And what I thought what might be nice today is just talk to Kevin about his life, about his upbringing, about his achievements in his life, about his military service, and also interweave what Australia was like as he went along on his journey of life. And maybe we can touch on some interesting experiences that he's had, and also some interesting connections that he's made along the way, because he's also got a lot of interesting contacts and really great contacts, people that he's met in his life. So let's bring him on, Mr. Kevin Loughrey. Welcome back, mate.
Oh, thank you very much, Steve. And my goodness, if we can't get you into Parliament, we've got to get you onto Sky TV. You are just meant to do this. You do. I just sit there and think, gee, you do a fantastic job.
Mate, sometimes I listen back to my interviews and I just cringe. I'm like, oh,
well,
I'm
such
a hard critic on myself.
Yeah, no, you're pretty good. You're pretty good, mate.
Oh, thanks, mate. It's high praise coming from you. Now, thanks for coming back home. We're doing some really exciting work with Australians for Better Government. There's a lot of stuff that's happening behind the scenes, which is encouraging as well. But I thought we'd just take the time out today to discuss you, because we've had you on the show quite a lot, but you've done so much in your life that I really wanted to flesh that out so the audience could get to know you a lot better, and maybe also talk about the way that Australia has developed since you've been alive, because you were born in the early 1950s, so there's a bit of ground to cover. Where were you born? And what was your upbringing like? I understand that your father was a squadron leader in World War II.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah.
He was stationed up in the islands at a place called Morotai, and used to fly around in things called Beaufighters, which were called Whispering Death. But he was an accountant with Elder Smith Goldsborough Mort, and at about the same time as I was born, he decided that he would leave that company and strike out on his own. He always wanted to run his own business. I don't ever think he had any great ambitions to be a big businessman. And instead, he chose a sleepy little area called Dinmore. Now, I was actually born at a place called Chelmer, just outside of Brisbane, 23 Plover Street, in fact, I think it was called. And we moved up to Dinmore in 1953. When I was 2 years of age, so I don't remember anything about that. My mother had always been extremely ill, and so it was necessary that I be put into foster care. And the last thing that, well, I shouldn't say the last thing, the very first thing I ever remember is seeing my mother walk off between some banana trees and the setting sun. I didn't have a clue what the hell was going on. And it's interesting, I was a little over 3 years of age, and I remember that very clearly. It must have been fairly traumatic to have been separated from my family. And so I was brought up by another family until I was 5 years of age, at which stage I could go to primary school, and then I wasn't as much a burden on the household. So I was brought home when I was 5 years of age. And it's very interesting that I can remember very clearly all sorts of things as whilst I was in foster care, like, for example, working out that letters actually had sounds and trying to teach myself to read. My father bought 2 bikes, one for a little boy who was adopted that I was living with, and for myself. And I remember watching a girl ride a bike. When these were delivered, it was all a big thing out in the front of the yard. And this girl rode a bike up the street. And I can remember as a 4-year-old, I looked at that and I said, I can do that. And I got on this bike and I rode it the first time without trainer wheels. And the poor kid who was with me, little boy my size, he had a great deal of difficulty. But it impressed upon me a whole lot of things that I think I've learned a lot more by watching other people than I've learned academically. And I believe that a lot of people are like this. You can watch somebody do something and then you imitate them. Other things, my father once came to visit me whilst I was in foster care, and things were pretty miserable. After the Second World War, by the way, life was very austere, and the people who had me in foster care, the man was in fact a coal miner, and he used to have to work until 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. He worked a 5.5-day week in the mines, and he'd come home absolutely filthy every night, bone tired. But my father came to see me, and I was separated by a fence from him, and I got a bit sad, and tears started to well up in my eyes. And my father said, "Oh, you're not crying on me, are you, son?" And it was very interesting that as a 4-year-old, I felt compelled to lie to him and said, "No, Dad, it's just the sun's getting in my eyes." And the roles were actually reversed. Later, a few weeks before my father died, I went to visit him in a retirement village, and there he was sitting at the table, and he invited me to come to lunch. And he said, "Kev, there were 7 other guys with me, and they've all passed away, and I'm the last man standing." And I felt that I was on the other side of the gate, and he was the guy who was in the foster care. It was a very interesting experience. So that's my recollection of being an infant. And I often look at my grandchildren and so forth, and I think to myself, I wonder if they're as aware of what's going on as I was. I used to even correct kids for their English. I knew somebody was lying to me when they said, "I never did that." I would say, no, you didn't do it. And that was, I used to look for telltale signs that someone was telling me pork pies. But anyway,
mate, I should tell everyone that you're still correcting my English now, which is good. I mean, I need it. I was educated by the New South Wales education system, so I definitely need that bit of guidance. But you're still doing that
move
today.
On to education. Look, I mentioned things were hard in those days. None of the streets were, macadamized. Well, they were macadamized, but they weren't tarmacked. They didn't have bitumen on them. And what amazed me also was that my parents, from the age of 5, allowed me to ride around on this bicycle, which the interesting thing about the bicycle was when I got home, I was introduced for the first time to my 3 brothers. I had 3 elder brothers, and that was the first time I could remember meeting them. And they took me out on my bike, and they took me to a place called Browns Hill. And when I got on to Browns Hill, which was a very steep hill, and I remind you that there's no bitumen or anything like that, it was just rock. As I'm going down Browns Hill, it suddenly dawned on me that I didn't have brakes. Now, you can't, can you imagine having a bicycle in this day and age that did not have brakes? Well, they used to make bicycles in those days that didn't have brakes. My front pedals were connected directly to the sprocket at the rear of the thing, and there was no way of stopping this bike. So my memory of riding the bike down Browns Hill was one of sheer panic. And when I got to the bottom of the hill, there was a creek and a very narrow bridge, 1-lane bridge, wooden bridge. And it was a case of I went off the road. My brothers were shouting out to me, fall off. And I wasn't going to fall off onto the rocky road because it would have just torn me badly. So anyway, I did an Evel Knievel and landed in the middle of this creek. My brothers then had to pull me out because I didn't know how to swim, and rescued the bike. So there's some of the sort of early memories. So the other things are that we didn't have sewerage in any way. We had an outdoor toilet. And we used to have the dunny man would call twice a week to empty the toilet, exchange the bins. My father owned a shop at Dinmore and a post office and a news agency. And when I first arrived there, they used to stay open until 6 o'clock at night. So I could remember walking around in my pajamas and dressing gown and then being shooed out by my parents to go back to the back of the house. The house was at the back of the shop, directly connected to it. And interesting, moving off from that a little bit, I have two grandsons and a pretty wonderful son-in-law who wanted his grandsons to see how his father had lived. So we went up to Dinmore to look at what was the shop. I got to say, I was shocked because it was a really, really tiny place. And there were 6 people in there, the 4 boys and my mother and father at the back of this shop. And it was still as primitive as ever. The electrical cables ran along the wall and were held by a brass staple. You weren't allowed to have more than one power point in your rooms in post-war Queensland because they had such power shortages. we might go back to that with climate change and what they're up to. Yeah. We had tank water. Mum used to do the clothes in a copper, the wood-fired copper out the back, and we had a mangle, which was 2 rollers that you turned, and we had a washing board that you would scrub. We had a concrete wash tub, which was 2 concrete wash tubs joined together, which had lead along the top. I always remember the lead. I've just someone just said you learn to put your boot in the tire.
Yeah, we got a comment from Graham. He said you'd soon learn to put your boot on the tire. That was the brakes back then. So
one little problem: I didn't wear shoes until I went to high school. So,
there you go.
That was another problem. Yeah,
but
didn't wear shoes.
Tell me, the fact that your father was a squadron leader in World War II, did he come back with any stories about that conflict?
Yeah, one, he told us that some Japanese, they'd caught them raiding the kitchen because they were starving, and they killed them on the spot. And Dad was very sad about that. He was quite distressed that these Japanese were bayoneted to death in front of him. But, it's a different world. I had an uncle, not an uncle, an uncle-in-law, you could call him, in Western Australia. He was called the Viking because he was actually dropped off on Timor as part of the commando group, and then they were more or less deserted, and he grew a big red beard. And their idea of amusement was to creep into Japanese camps, cut rubber off the tire to make their sandals, and then hang around the next morning to watch the Japanese guard get beaten up by the officer when the officer discovers that there's a footprint cut into the tire of the truck. So it was a different world. But yeah, no, my father once described how he was in a Beaufighter and they tested the guns and he almost wet himself thinking that they were under attack. So yeah, there were stories like that, but generally my dad didn't want to talk about, the war or what had happened. He often went back to how we got into the war and how grateful we should be to the United States that it became involved. He talked often about Milne Bay and the fact that the Battle of the Coral Sea most probably saved Milne Bay, prevented the Japanese from being able to reinforce to get around to Moresby. And Milne Bay, by the way, was the first time that the Japanese had been defeated in Southeast Asia on the land. Up until then, the Japanese had been victorious in everything that they'd been involved in. So yeah, that's about all that came out of the war. We never, Dad would get quite strong about how the government had failed us. I didn't, as a young man, I never appreciated that. It's only as I've gotten older that I've become aware of how badly governed we've been since Federation. The fact that we went to war with such poor equipment.
That's that's a good question because at the time of the war, Sir Robert Menzies was Prime Minister when he was back in the United Australia Party, and then he lost that throughout the war, and it was mainly Chifley, John.
Right.
Sorry, not Chifley, John Curtin. That was the Prime Minister.
Curtin,
Yeah. Did he lay the blame more on Menzies or Curtin or both?
No, he just generally. Evidently, the government voted against a supply bill to get more ammunition when we were at the height of the New Guinea campaign. The government took the view that the taxpayers couldn't bear this expense. At the same time, unions deliberately loaded the ships for Milne Bay upside down so that the stores that were most urgently needed were at the bottom of the ship. Things like that were happening. My father-in-law was a rat of Tobruk, and he served with great distinction there, was very seriously wounded and repatriated back to Australia. And he told me that they would sit there and read articles in the newspaper which were most derogatory about the chaps who were over in the Middle East. So we have a very checkered history when it comes to fighting war. And because I invented two rifles in 1970 odd, in fact 1960 going 1970, I started thinking about why did we go to war in 39 armed with bolt action rifles from the Boer War, when the Americans developed a semi-automatic rifle in 1931 and issued their army with this semi-automatic rifle in 1936. It was the Garand. It fired a .3 of an inch round, and it was very effective, and it could lay down one hell of a lot of firepower.
Well, it's amazing when you say that and you think about what the Australians achieved, particularly at the siege of Tobruk. Yeah, I mean, if they fought off the might of the German army with Rommel at the helm.
Exactly
he called them.
Just think what they could have done if they'd been properly equipped. There's no shortage of, I can speak with some authority that the people I served with were exceptional in the ranks, the privates, the sergeants, the corporals, and so forth. In fact, my favorite rank is warrant officer. I think they're God's gift to officers. That's the warrant officer, the warrant officer class. They're all exceptional men. And they are fantastic.
Graham's saying the same thing. He said Australia was severely underprepared for World War II. Funding was so poor, most of the military was using World War I equipment.
That's correct. Yeah. And my father-in-law was armed with a Thompson submachine gun, which they'd borrowed from the United States. And it was firing 45 caliber ammunition. The Bren gun, many people talk about the Bren gun, but having used the Bren gun, I can tell you it's not a good weapon. And yet the Australians did amazing things with Bren guns. The Bren gun had a 30-round magazine that sat on top of the weapon, so it wasn't balanced well. You could only fire it right-handed. You had to put the butt into your right shoulder, whether you were a right or left-handed person. You could only operate it as a right-handed person. They never ever provided a charger to be able to load ammunition into the magazine. And if you've ever been terrified, you would know that it's really, really difficult to get your mind and your body to work together. I can just imagine the panic of the number two on the gun trying to load the magazines manually. The weapon itself, in a way, was too accurate in that the mean point of impact of the rounds was very close together. So whereas the Germans had what was called the MG32, and the MG32 could lay down fire at about 1,200 rounds per minute, whereas the Bren typically, I think, is about 500 rounds per minute. They reckon when an MG32 lights up, it's like hearing paper tearing, and they're just deadly. We had footwear which were leather boots with hobnails in them, which were totally bloody useless in the mud. And we had mud gaiters, which were difficult to put on. I mean, time-consuming to put on. If you have to get up and get into your foxhole, you don't want to be stuffing around with, mud gaiters and a boot. You just want to slip the boots on and get moving. We had load carrying equipment, which was nothing. It was basically a Hessian bag with straps.
Yeah.
You compare what the Germans had when they flew, the German paratroopers had when they flew into Crete. Honestly, we have not been well served by our government, not at all.
But
Occasionally we have flashes of brilliance, but rare.
But that goes to show the strength of character of the Australian troops at the time.
Absolutely.
I mean, tell me, from you growing up, like what are your memories of men from this period? Like, because the Germans would talk about being terrified of Australian soldiers, and the German generals held them in very, very high regard. But just, you grew up in the 1950s, so it was a little bit of time past from the Second World War. What were the men like? Did you look up to
They
them?
were very, very, oh, absolutely. They were very serious, very stern, and very well controlled, like highly disciplined in themselves, the way that they carried themselves. Yeah, no, and I was blessed to have teachers like that as well. I had a number of male teachers who were exceptional. I also had some female teachers who were really, really good as well. But no, it was a different age. And it was hard, it was really hard. I remember when I was, in foster care, we used to go to this lady, her name was Mrs. Bognuda, and I would sit on the floor, drawing and things like that. And I'd listen to the conversations around the dinner table where all of these women would sit. Now, that's another thing too, by the way, that the women stayed at home. And the women went to tennis. I remember going to tennis, but the women looked after the children and they looked after them well. But we were sitting around, they were sitting around the table and I was listening to them, and they were talking about how they used to send Sunlight soap to their husbands up in New Guinea because they couldn't get soap. They used to send them toilet paper. Although newspaper was the stuff that we used at Dinmore, basically the newspaper was in the outhouses. We used that as toilet paper. But I remember how they would send socks and they would send Sunlight soap and razors to their husbands who were up in New Guinea.
When you talk about
different people.
When you talk about how hard it was, I guess we should put it into context because this is 1950. It's roughly
6 years after the war. Yeah.
Just over 150 years since the British arrived in Australia. I mean, it's not a lot of a time to establish a society. Despite the wealth that the country had created up until that point, I mean, it's still difficult to get everything up to speed. Now, the difficulties that you faced, you talk about being poor and it being a struggle after the war. Was that a result of the war, or was that just Australia leading into the war?
No, it was the result of bad economic management. And once again, instead of letting the market go free, the government, which was a Labor government, and then the Liberals came in after the war, they were very controlling about everything. And we've got some remnants of that sort of thing happening even today with the housing shortage that we're experiencing at this moment. We have, I think, always to an extent been overregulated. But yeah, it was very austere, and we were paying off a huge debt. We'd borrowed a lot of money for the war, so we as a country were paying off a huge debt. Yes, that's about it. That's all I really can say about it.
Well, this was the time of Robert Menzies. He came into power for his second term in 1949, and he was Prime Minister up until 1966.
Yes.
What are your memories of Robert Menzies? We're talking about the 50s here, but by the 60s, did he pull Australia out of these hard economic times? Was he a good leader? Did he advance Australia? I mean, he's often looked as one of our best prime ministers, but what's your opinion of him?
I remember sitting with an American in the Kit Kat Club in Brisbane. I used to go there and have tomato and cheese on toast. And we got talking, and he commented at how different our society was, that our society was relatively homogenous, that we didn't have racial tension and such like. And I remember saying to him, yes, that's because we have had as a policy, we bring in people into our country who will assimilate readily, rather than shopping for a whole lot of different cultures and races, where you end up with rub points in your community and you also lose social trust. In those days, you could leave your house unlocked. There's no question of it. You could it was a totally different country. As an example, when I was at high school, I used to shoot competitively at the Red Bank Rifle Range. And I would go on a Friday afternoon, draw a 303 rifle from the armory, from the cadet armory, along with a bolt. I'd put the bolt into my briefcase and I'd hop on the train at Ipswich, travel down to Dinmore, get off at Dinmore. Now, this is a 15 going 16-year-old. And I would carry the rifle and so forth home. I'd clean it and make sure it was in the best possible condition, get on the train on a Saturday morning at around about 11 o'clock, go down to Red Bank and then walk across to the rifle range, big bore rifle range at Red Bank. And there I would shoot with my Army 303 open sights. And then I'd go home, clean the rifle. Monday morning, I'd deliver it to the cadet armory. It would be, taken in again. And that was what you would do. Now, can you imagine in this day and age, anybody getting onto onto public transport with a 303 rifle?
well, probably not.
No,
but,
you couldn't.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that you have this is that we have experienced considerable social dislocation since the 1950s to the present day. And you've also commented on this, that we have now a situation where two people, the mother and the father, have to work. And even then, trying to buy a house is not easy. It's very difficult. And this is deliberate, I believe. Either that or it's just such incredible incompetence. I've often said that, and in fact, part of my political campaign in the last election was, look, we shouldn't have a housing shortage. We've got 17 million square kilometres of land. And really what the government should do is it should release Crown land and also buy at the agricultural rates, maybe pay the farmer twice per hectare that what the farmer would get if they were selling it as a farm, and then rezone that and hire contractors on competitive tender to develop that land to 800 square metre service blocks and then sell them at cost to young married couples who have never owned a house before. Now, if you did that, they could get that 800 square metre block of land for around about $50,000. You can build a modest 3-bedroom house for somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. So you're talking of young married couples being able to get into their own block of land with a modest 3-bedroom house for under $300,000. The mortgage for that, the cost of servicing the mortgage for that would be less than most young people are paying in rent. But the government doesn't want to do that. At this moment.
But here's the thing, Kevin. I mean, we're still talking about the 50s, but in the 70s and 80s, I mean, a husband could go to work, support the family and also have a mortgage and buy a house while the mother stayed at home and looked after the kids. Now that's virtually impossible in this country, despite the fact that we've gone through a mining boom. I mean, we should be one of the richest countries in the world. And that never gets explained, how it went from that back in the past to where we're at now, where a lot of families are having to rent, but not just rent, live with other people as well in shared accommodation because they just can't afford to get by in their own property. What happened? Why does that not get explained? That
they restricted the release of land. That's what happened. And, I've actually mentioned before, and it might be on your show or whatever, but if you drive from here over to Lismore on the left-hand side, as you're on the outskirts of Lismore, there's this big sign saying, as if proud of it, you can get this marvelous block of land for $349,000. Now, I know that land was initially sold at $4,000 a hectare. And in a hectare, you can get 800 square metre blocks of land. So if you divide 8 into 4,000, that's $500 a block. Somehow we went from $500 a block to 300,000, because it certainly doesn't cost you $49,000 to put in sewerage, electricity, communications, and have a tarmac road running past your property. So that's what's happened. You've got councils, you've got a government that, instead of them saying, look, it's our responsibility to make sure that young married couples can afford a house, they've said, let's leave it to the market. Let's let speculators buy farming land and we'll rezone it with cozy deals. And then at the end of the day, we can sell this block of land for $350,000 when it really ought to be $50,000, and we'll pocket $300,000 per block. That's how we got here.
Got a comment from Graham. Graham says the Australia Kevin is talking about was bred out half a century ago. It began in the Whitlam years. We lost it all with Hawke and Keating. Do you agree with that comment?
Yeah. Look, in fact, I would go back beyond Whitlam. I reckon it started with Holt. Holt undid an awful lot of what Menzies had created. And I often wonder whether he got assassinated for that, or somebody lifted him. But the whole Aboriginal industry started with Whitlam. This idea, this victim idea, the rewriting of Australian history. You've already had Christopher Reynolds on, a person for whom I have high regard, nice bloke and a brilliant historian. And really every school kid needs to be taught what Christopher has written about in his book, Australia, What a Capital Idea. I think it might be What a Capital Idea, Australia. But anyway, it's something along that line. But
what a capital idea. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
I've got it right.
You've got it. Yeah. Why don't we show the viewers and give Christopher a bit of a boost? I really recommend that book to everybody, and it ought to be mandatory reading in primary school, because it tells how the early colonialists went to extreme levels, including getting speared, by the way. Governor Phillip was speared in the shoulder and refused to take any action because he was so desperate to become friends with the Aborigines. And he did become friends.
There's actually a plaque in the Northern Beaches which talks about that. I won't tell anyone where it is, because some ratbag activists will go and burn it down or something. But it's the truth, and that's not the story that we get told now. We have this black armband view of history, and I only spoke to Dr. Reynolds on last week's episode, and we brought up that footage of Lyndall Ryan from the University of Newcastle, going on a national broadcast and admitting that she all historians make stuff up. Yeah, and that was in relation to her making up stuff about the supposed genocide and massacres of the Aboriginal people.
That's right.
And it's just disgusting what goes on in this country.
We've gone a little bit off the agenda, but I'm happy to keep on here because you've raised another one, and that's that the Victorian government has just recently more or less sponsored a farce of an inquiry, which is just appalling. Just like the stolen generation thing was absolutely appalling. It's funny, I've sort of almost paralleled some Aboriginal people in that regard, in that I was put into foster care because my mother couldn't look after me. Interestingly, my brother was murdered by 2 Aborigines, or people who claimed they were Aborigines. I don't call people who are of mixed race Aborigines. I think it's all a farce. But these 2 guys bashed my brother's head in to steal $128 from him, and then they were supported by the Aboriginal industry in court and so forth. Really, we should all be treated exactly the same. We should not have a welfare system that discriminates on the basis of a person's race. It should, in fact, be determined by a person's circumstances. And if a person needs welfare, regardless of their race, they should be entitled to it, and we should do our damnedest to try and get them off welfare to make them self-sufficient, for them to be able to look after themselves. That should be the focus of all welfare. I'm quite passionate, and in fact, when I think about my brother, I get very, very upset.
Of course you would.
This is. I get upset with the whole bloody industry because it's just one huge fraud, yet another that's being perpetrated upon the Australian people. We waste $100 million a day on the Aboriginal industry, and those useless people and I could drop to pejoratives, but those useless people that populate our parliamentary benches refuse to hold an audit to find out where that money is going to, because it sure as hell is not doing much to help the people who most need it.
Well, I can understand why you're so passionate about one of the proposals we have at Australians for Better Government, and that is to amend the line in Section 51, subsection 26 of the Australian Constitution. You want to push for a referendum to change that line.
Yes.
So currently it says that the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order, and good governments of the Commonwealth with respect to the people of any race to whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. So this is otherwise known as the race clause in the Constitution, and basically this opens up the opportunity for government to establish this Aboriginal industry where they can make specific laws. That's just right. For the Aboriginal people or any type of people. I mean, it could happen in the future where they make special laws on a particular race. Now, you want to not just remove this line, but replace it, I guess, amend it. And we're going to be doing some work behind the scenes over the next few weeks and months to really push for a referendum on this, and hopefully people can get behind us, because, as you said, we should all be treated equally. And yes, the fact that this race clause is in our Constitution, it's terrible. It should be struck out as soon as possible.
Absolutely. And, when you go back and you look at the public briefing for the referendum that happened in 1967, you suddenly become aware that we were deceived, that there was a huge deception perpetrated upon the Australian people. For the Australian people believed that they were voting for racial equality, and nothing could be further from the truth. There was also no case ever presented regarding that. What they did, they had a clause in the Constitution which was pre-1900. Its genesis was pre-1900, and it had to do with the laborers that were brought from the South Pacific. They were called Kanakas, and also the Chinese that had come down into the goldfields. And because they wanted Australia to be a British nation, largely populated by Anglo-Saxons, even, by the way, people from Europe, like French and German, weren't entirely welcome at that time. It was Britain. It was effectively another place of Great Britain. They had this clause that said that the federal government could make special laws with the exception of Aboriginal people of the Aboriginal race on the basis of their race. Now, we were convinced in 1967 in a referendum to get rid of, with the exception of people of the Aboriginal race. But they conflated that question with another, which was that Aborigines would be counted in the census for the purposes of determining electoral representation. In other words, where electoral boundaries would be. Now, up until then, any person who was of the Aboriginal race who had joined modern society, was working and paying tax, could vote. They were considered not to be Aborigines. They were considered to just be normal people. When they talked of Aborigines, they were talking of native Aborigines. These were people who basically walked around pretty much naked, were hunter-gatherers, could not speak English, were not literate, could not do any mathematics. And they were totally dependent on government welfare at that stage, organised by the states. And the states even had a protector of Aborigines assigned to look after their welfare. These were the people who it was considered could not vote for the simple reason they were incapable of being aware of the politics of the nation, and could be induced by tobacco or alcohol to vote in a certain way. But by 1962, it was decided, look, that we can get rid of that. And we had the 1962 Electoral Act. Coming back to it, they conflated the two questions into one. So instead of Australians voting, look, do you want Aborigines to be counted in the census? And we do away with, worrying about native Aborigines because there are none any longer. And do you want the federal government, do you want a clause in the federal government that allows the federal government to make laws on the basis of a citizen's race? There weren't two questions, and there was never a no case put on this. So the whole thing was a setup. And as soon as it went through, Labor rubbed their hands and said, "You beauty, now we can get on with our agenda, which is Marxism, that we will cause division in the Australian society on the basis of race." And they've done the same with gender. And that's why I want that referendum where we say, look, no government at any level can discriminate on the basis of a citizen's race, sex, or ancestry. And that's the way it should be. We're all equal.
Look, I think it's important to discuss Gough Whitlam and all of this, but before we get there, we've moved well beyond you joining the
You predicted this would happen anyway. Yeah, so, yeah.
But we've moved well beyond you joining the military. Now, how old were you when you joined the military, and why did you join the military?
Well, my mum died when I was 16. And she died of a massive heart attack. She'd always been very ill. And she was a fantastic lady. She actually worked in the shop, and I would say that the business that we got in the shop was largely as a consequence of Mum's personality, because she was loved by everybody in the district, and when she died, it was a very big funeral. But yeah, so I basically found myself in a situation where Dad was falling apart. Dad loved Mum very much. In fact, many years later, I had Dad come to visit me in Germany when I'd been seconded there, and he used to call out my mum's name in the night while he was asleep. So, first off, I applied to join the RAF, and I was accepted for pilot training, and they said, no, look, we can't really accept you for Point Cook because you come from a disturbed family background, and we don't think that you would succeed in a university course. I feel like sometimes going and jamming my honours degree up their backside. But
what do they mean by disturbed family?
Well, because you see, basically Mum was dead. My brothers had left home largely. My father was not coping. His business was not doing all that well because, a whole range of things happened. He gave away a lot of groceries for free to people in the district when they hit hard times. I think there was some sort of crisis around that time where the coal mines weren't doing too well, so Dad found himself in a bit of debt.
Can you imagine a government department, I guess, like the military, saying that to someone these days? I mean, it's complete 180 now. I mean, it sounds so harsh
Well, that's what they said, but it was interesting. I was sitting out on the back steps of the home, and my brother Blair, who's an absolute saint, older than me, he's he was one brother ahead, sort of. I have my brother Peter is the next guy next to me, and then there's Blair, and Blair's always been the hard worker and so forth. And he came up to me and said, look, Kev, I just saw this ad in the paper, and it's for this place called Duntroon in a place called Canberra. And I'm thinking, where the hell is Canberra? I knew it was the capital of Australia, but I'd never bothered about the geography. So he said, look, give it a go. You got nothing to worry about. And so I went for the selection course at Duntroon, and we had to do. Actually, it was in Sydney. I'm trying to remember the place where we went, but it was a place on the coast, and we had to do all of these things like construct bridges and so forth as a team. And at the end, they said, "Yeah, look, we're going to accept you for Duntroon." And when all the gathering was over and all the rah-rah, I walked up to this guy and I said to him, am I really in? And he said, yeah, you're in. And I said, can I tell you something? And they won't reverse it. And he said, no, you'll be fine. I said, look, I actually applied for the RAF, and they told me that because I came from an unstable family background that I most probably did not have good prospects at Point Cook. And this guy, Ed Lewis, looked at me and said, Kev, the reason you were selected is you came from an unstable background, because I'm telling you now, you're about to experience hell on earth, and you won't be able to run home to mummy. You've got nowhere to go. And we actually want people like you in the army, because you will make the army your family. And he was absolute. Ed Lewis, his name was, and a psychiatrist, and he was dead right. I've got 60 brothers that we would all die for each other. We have reunions and all the rest of it. The army became my family, and I'm so grateful I made that decision, I can tell you, because I got to deal with truly exceptional young men. We were all handpicked at Duntroon. We were all athletic and of a generally high academic capability. So it was, I got really lucky getting to Duntroon, I can tell you.
Do you have a sense of how you felt at the time? Like, what was your reaction going into the military? Did you like it? Did you love it? I mean, were there aspects of it that you liked more than others?
One of my lifelong friends is a fellow called Graham Smith. He's a fantastic bloke, along with another guy, Warwick Elliott. And I was at the Southern Command Personnel Depot at Kelvin Grove, waiting to board a bus to get on a plane to fly down to Sydney, to Watson's Bay it was, that's right. And his father came in. Now, his father was a major, and his father had survived Changi prison camp. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you scared, son?" And I'm looking at him thinking, now I got to be pretty cagey about this. And I said, no, I'm apprehensive. And that's how I felt, mate. Look, my name originally was Loughrey. My father was called Loughrey. That's how we pronounced the name. When I got off the train at Kingston in Canberra, we were greeted by these warrant officers, and we had a roll call. And there's Sergeant Sergeant Burson, Jerry Burson, called me Loughrey. I wasn't going to say, "Oh, excuse me, please, sir. Maybe it's actually not pronounced that way." And it just stuck. And it got to a point where I could not reverse it. And then I went to the ASCO canteen, and there was this Irish guy there. And he saw my name tag. He said, "Oh, Loughrey, that comes from Ireland." I said, "Is that how you pronounce it?" He said, "Yeah, it's Loughrey." I said, "Oh, thank you very much. That was a great comfort." And that's how I became Loughrey. As simple as that. And it stuck with me ever since. And I must say, I prefer it to Loughrey anyway.
Now, you were seconded by the British Army for 4 years. You also spoken about how you spent time in Germany, and I think you've even mentioned that you've spent time in China. Like, what were some of the countries that you sent off to whilst in the military, and what were your opinions of some of these countries?
Well, I was seconded to the British Army twice. Once to go to Germany and serve in NATO. And I was at 7th Armoured Workshop, and I commanded what was called a forward company, that basically 22 armoured vehicles and 7 armoured recovery vehicles, which were chieftain tanks with cranes and so forth. And that was really very interesting. Sometimes I think that I wasn't the best of guests. I had a big mouth at times. And I said things which I regret now, in terms of, being critical of the British Army and so forth. They have the similar sorts of problems I have. The people that I served with were exemplary, were fantastic. I was very, very fortunate. And I remained good friends with one who has now sadly passed away, David Doyle. He was the person who he was a warrant officer who commanded the recovery element. And I worked as the divisional recovery officer on Exercise Lionheart. I was responsible for the 1st Division and pulling out any tanks and so forth that got themselves into difficulty. And in fact, we managed to extricate 12 of 13 chieftain tanks out of a quagmire near Celle. We had to blow up the 13th in situ, but that involved us building a road about 3 kilometres long, and we did that in 2 weeks. I often look at how long councils take to build a road here and despair. but no, honestly, it was a fantastic experience. Then I was posted to Warminster, to the largest district workshop in the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence. I developed a computer program there which was fairly revolutionary, and it allowed them to automate tray store ordering and greatly improve the reliability of stores, which are essential for the building of a refurbishment of a multitude of different equipments, ranging from tanks through to night vision equipment. Initially, they had 6 people who used to cycle the workshop on a continuous basis. By the time I'd finished, we only needed 2 people once every Thursday fortnight to get the stores right. And that's an indication of the power of computers. I developed a means by which I could make an IBM PC imitate a dumb terminal, an ITL. I'd already succeeded in doing that with the Perkin-Elmer computers back here in Australia when I was the commanding officer of One Base Workshop Battalion. And I often found myself outside of where I was supposed to be. You know, I'd sort of wander off the piste, as they say. And I developed all of this computer software at night. And I wrote it in Turbo Pascal and did things which computer professionals said were impossible to do. But I managed to do it. And I managed to do it, I should tell you, with a lot of help from some truly exceptional and wonderful people.
So you're telling me that
do stuff for yourself.
You're telling me that while you had this opportunity to go overseas and experience these different countries, you'd sit in your room at night playing on your computer?
Yep, I would. Yeah, I would. Yeah. My son was born in Germany. I have 3 children. Now they're all adults, of course. My son was born in the British Medical Hospital in Germany. And I became good friends with a judge, a fellow called Jürgen Dane, the exceptional person. He was the judge who put away Baader-Meinhof, the terrorist gang. And Jürgen was under permanent protection. And he invited me to come out to his house for Easter, bring my family. We arrived at his house at a certain place obviously, I won't say where it is. And his wife, Hydron, by the way, these are 2 absolutely beautiful, wonderful people. His wife, Hydron, greeted us at the door and said to my wife, who was heavily pregnant, look, there are some things about our house I have to show you. And Jan said, oh, really? And she said, well, if you look at the window there, you'll see that it's very green at looking sideways. And Jan said, yeah, it is. And she said, that's because it's about 6 inches thick, 150 millimeters thick. And Jan's sort of thinking, why would you have 150 millimeter thick glass on your lounge room window? And then Jan touched the door, and the front door was like a safe. And she said, yes, the front door is in fact a safe. Now, if you could come inside for a moment. And she pulled back the curtain and there was a red button there. And she said, now, under no circumstances touch this red button, and don't let the children, and this was Felicity and Tammy, who could have possibly reached it if they got on their tippy toes, don't let them push this button either. If we have to push that button, then within around about 5 minutes, the police will arrive. And they will set off explosive charges in the door, which will blow the door off. And when you hear that, you must hit the floor, because anybody standing will be shot. And Jan says to me, I think we should go home now. So there's an exciting little story about, the real world in Germany at that time.
What was the purpose of it?
Well, because he was under threat. It's no different to the Islamists trying, having a fatwa on you. He had he had sentenced to jail the leaders of Baader-Meinhof, who had gone around assassinating public dignitaries in Germany. Okay. They were a Marxist group, and they were murdering politicians and judges and stuff like that. Yeah. And so he was under 24-hour protection at that time.
These experiences that you had in different countries, did it make you appreciate Australia more, or did you see things over there that you liked?
When I came back from England, now when we were in England, we had to bail out of our married quarters a couple of times because the IRA were looking for a lieutenant colonel to shoot, or a senior officer to shoot, and I happened to be that rank. And they'd accidentally shot a warrant officer, possibly 2 warrant officers. They shot them to death at Zeebrugge on the ferry, because the warrant officers in the British Army used to dress like officers. They would have a tie and a coat and look very, very dignified. And these IRA assassin group thought they were officers, so they shot to death these warrant officers on the Zeebrugge ferry. Now, I used to be very good at squash, and I played in tri-service. And one day I had been at the squash courts. I'd run home and I was having a shower, and my wife answered the door of the married quarter in Warminster, and there were these guys there in trench coats, and they said, "Look, we're from Special Branch. We need to speak to Colonel Loughrey." And my wife yelled out, "You've got to come down." And of course, I'm in a bath towel, naked. And I said to them, "Look, I'll just get in, minimal amount of clothing. I'll be with you in a second." And they then said, "Look, we need to speak to you privately." And I said, "Not a problem. Look, how about we meet back at my office?" And so they did meet me at the office, and they said, "Look, a lady in Warminster said that she had seen you with a woman in a camel coloured coat, and you were using the photocopier. The photocopier jammed, and she went and unjammed. They left, and she went and unjammed the photocopier, and it was a manual on how to make a bomb or how to rig up car bombs. And the reason we wanted to speak to you privately was that we want to know whether you've got a girlfriend, whether it was you. And if you have a girlfriend, we're not going to tell your wife. We just need you to tell us that, yes, I was doing that. I was only just doing research. And, that'll then mean we don't have to keep looking." I said, "No, absolutely not. I've been playing squash for the last hour, and I can account for all of my movements." And, I was able to show diaries and everything. I had to attend meetings at the workshop and stuff. And so they said, "All right, well, we do have a problem." They showed me a picture of the guy, and blow me down, he looked just like me with glasses. And of course, I'm of Irish-German background, so maybe that's why he looked like me. But so we had an IRA hit team running around Warminster, and we had to leave the barracks on numerous occasions to avoid the possibility of assassination. Not that they weren't, I wasn't the target. They were just looking for someone in the officers' area to kill. And an interesting thing happened, which I'll tell your listeners, which is funny. This guy, there was a bread van that used to go into the School of Infantry to deliver bread to the mess. And the plan was, the IRA decided that they were going to load up this bread van with a whole lot of explosive and park it next to the military instruction block where the officers were all being instructed, and kill a whole lot of officers. Anyway, the bread van was intercepted by the IRA on the way to the School of Infantry, and the guy dutifully got into the van with all of the explosives, and they got to the gate, and the driver jumped out of the vehicle and ran off. Now, the IRA chappie's in the back, but what the IRA had not figured on was that the door locks from the outside, and he was inside with a bomb that was going to go off. And he had no way of stopping it from going off, and he's trapped inside the vehicle. So he's trying busily to get out of the vehicle, and the guards are sort of trying to clear the vehicle because they think it's going to blow up at any moment. And it was really quite an interesting experience. Anyway, they got the guy out, they got the EOD, explosive ordnance disposal people in, and they disarmed the bomb. But they're the sorts of things which happened there. Now, when we got back to Australia, to answer your question, I had to go to Joint Services Staff College. And the very first thing my children commented on was, firstly, there were no people around with submachine guns guarding the place, as there were in the School of Infantry and Germany. And secondly, that you could leave your bag. You've never, ever left your bag unattended. But people would put their briefcases down and then walk away and, have a drink or whatever. And my daughters were so programmed that they said, "Daddy, they're leaving their briefcases there. They shouldn't do that." And so, yes, there was a big difference between living in Europe and Britain.
That's a real thing, because I remember my grandparents talking about that, about how great Australia used to be. You wouldn't lock anything; you'd leave stuff
That's right.
around. I mean, nothing. I mean, domestic violence still happen. Sometimes the husband would be drunk and bash the wife or something like that. But generally, the country was very, very safe and harmonious, as you said before. Now, you talked a little bit about Harold Holt. After Harold Holt, we had John Gorton and William McMahon, still
That's right.
Liberal Party prime ministers. That was before we got Whitlam in 1972. Were you paying attention politically at that stage? Were you keeping up with everything? What were your views?
I was at Duntroon when I was entering my final years at Duntroon when Whitlam was elected. And the general feeling was one of concern, because my father, I'd been brought up by a politically aware father. And I now reflect on many of the things he said, and they were profound, and they went right over the top of my head in those days. I didn't understand. I really didn't grasp the profundity of what he was saying. But yeah, we knew we were heading into socialism, and my father was really, really virulently against socialism. His feeling was, look, if somebody's intellectually or physically disabled, as a humane society, we have an utmost obligation to look after them. But if anybody can work, they work. They work for their money, and they, basically look after themselves. And my father also was a strong advocate that the government's role was to make it very easy for anybody to form their own business, or anybody to be employed, to move from one employment to the other, because he felt that then, if people can move from one employment to the other, the employer has to provide their employee with the best conditions that they can afford. Otherwise, they'll lose that person. And that stuck with me very much. It stuck with me for the whole of my life. And we are doing exactly the opposite. We've made it very, very difficult for an employer to dismiss an unsatisfactory employee. And with things like superannuation and so forth, we've made it difficult for people to be able to be mobile, to move from one employment to the other easily without a hell of a lot of administrative argy-bargy along the way. Employers now are expected to pay a 17.5% loading when a person goes away on leave and they're non-productive. An employer is supposed to find 3 months of wages for a person once they've served in that business for 10 years. The employer has to find workers' compensation, superannuation, when really these are personal matters that an employee should look after for themselves. It's got nothing to do with the employer. And my father particularly resented the government getting between him and his employees. It was a personal business. And by the way, the people who served in my father's shop were more or less lifelong. They were part of the family. They loved my father and my mother, truly. So it was a very personal relationship. And I suspect that applied to 99% of the businesses, the small businesses, that they were small. Yeah, you had the occasional, nasty person, but then you had the occasional delinquent employees. And I'd like us to go back to a day when there was no minimum wage. And by the way, Australia's always had a minimum wage since about the late 1800s to the present day, where there were no wage awards. The government's got nothing, it should have nothing to do with how much a person gets paid. That's between the person and their employer. And that's the way it should be. If the government has a role to play, it should be in making it very easy for an employee to find another job. In other words, you've then got competition. And once upon a time, you used to have a thing called the Government Employment Agency, and they used to really do a reasonable job. My brothers called on them on a number of occasions. As an experiment, back in, would have been about 1998, I decided I would go to Centrelink and see what jobs were available. I'd started a business in 1997 and it was bloody hard work. And I'm thinking maybe I made a mistake here. I should go and look. And Centrelink were absolutely useless. They handed me across to a contractor who was equally useless. And I started thinking, and this came about because I spent a lot of time going backwards and forwards to China because my brother was up in China. He graduated from Beijing University, married a Chinese lady, and was up there for about 25 years doing various things. So I used to visit him fairly regularly. And there's absolutely no reason why the government could not have a web page where, as a service, it says to every employer in Australia, if you want to, you can put an ad for help wanted up here on this web page. And similarly, if you are looking for a job, you can put an ad up there on that web page, and we will provide software with a certain amount of artificial intelligence that will try to help you link up with employers or employees. And this in no way negates the role that a personal placement agency would play in this process. Because, for example, if I'm running a company and I say, look, I want to find people who will do this job, I could say to the personal placement agency, I want you to put that ad up there, put a link to you, and anybody who applies for that job, they can, they will deal with you, and then you advise me on which person you think would be best to do this, and I'll pay you a commission for finding that person and vetting them. And that's what we should do, and no such proper facility is available here in Australia.
I got a comment here from Martin. He says, incorrect. These benefits are traded out of the wage rate. Therefore, the employee funds this by accepting a reduced hourly rate. What are your thoughts on that?
Not true. Not when it was brought in. It was funded. It was a part of a deal that was done where the employer had to pay the money, and it was effectively a wage rise. And that's what happened. Now, it might, in reality, what that gentleman is saying is true, because there's only so much of the cake to be had. And once all the dust is settled, in reality, that's what's going on.
Well, that's the thing. It's not a charity. I mean, these companies that exist to make money, and they can't just be forking out dollars everywhere for people. And I guess that's why the government, I feel, was resorted to expanding the public sector. Because they've gone into the business of keeping the employment rate low by giving people jobs, and that's why 400,000 jobs were created by the Albanese government supposedly in their first term, but only 7,000 of those were in the private sector. Everything else went into the public sector. So that's government jobs with government money, taxpayers' money funding it all.
Taxpayers' money. It's a circular economy. Yeah. And, we could go through the theory of economics, which I won't bore you with here, but you get a lot more value to your society if people actually do work for money. And that means, like, for example, you pay me to do your fly screens on your house. Would you benefit from getting the fly screens? Now I've got the money, I go and get someone else to do something for me, maybe clean my car or I'm able to buy a book and so forth. But when you've got a situation where the tax is being taken off workers, put into a government machine, and then they're providing often a service that's not really required, you're going down the toilet.
And that's why you always want people to have confidence in the economy, so they do go out and spend. If they're hoarding their money in a bank account, the economy is not going to grow, because that's circulation of the money flowing through is not happening.
Yes, and I've actually got a convoluted logic I'll hit you with. If I do, let's pretend I do a lot of work for somebody, for a whole lot of people, and I end up with an awful lot of money in my bank account, and I don't use that. That means I've given a whole lot of stuff to people, and I've never called in the IOUs. Do you see what I'm getting at? That rich people haven't called in the IOUs, because let's pretend we go back to pre-money. If I fixed up your fly screen, you could give me a little sheet of paper saying, look, this is to record that Stephen Tripp owes Kevin Loughrey 2 hours of work, and this is transferable. So I can go down the road to somebody and say, listen, could you make that clay pot for me? And he says, look, it'll take me 2 hours. I said, well, look, here's an IOU that I've got from Stephen Tripp, and you can go to him and he'll give you 2 hours of work. And that's how the IOU works, you see. But now I've got a whole lot of IOUs, and I've never gone back to the society saying, look, I want to cash these in. The rich people are actually not calling in the IOUs. It's a different way of looking at things. But coming back to superannuation for a moment, the real tragedy we have here is we have multiple tragedies in this country. The first one is that the unions have largely control of the industry superannuation funds, and they are skimming the money off the top, and that's going into the Labor Party, which is going into the socialists. Next,
and look, you got to hand it to Keating, and he was brilliant for bringing it in from a Labor Party perspective. Right. If you're a Labor Party person, you're looking at Keating like he's the messiah for doing that.
Yep, and it's killing our country. Socialism will kill the country. The next thing is that you've got beside the fact that you're draining there. I've lost my train of thought, by the way. I'm trying to think.
You were going to talk about superannuation.
Yeah. That they're draining. Oh, that's right. I was going to say that the public service. Yeah, I wasn't talking about superannuation. That's why my trolley jumped the track. The public service is dominated by the unions, and the Labor Party is the political arm of the unions. So the consequence of this is that the administrative arm or branch of government is dominated permanently by the Labor Party. That's why you end up on every web page, you've got this rubbish. We pay our respects to, elders past and present, and all that BS. That the politicians largely did not have anything to do with that. That's why it went on during the Liberal Party. It was all the grubby little public servants who are actually Labor acolytes who have put all this crap, which, by the way, the taxpayer paid for, all over the place. When you're driving along, you see these signs by the side of the road saying you're about to enter the land of the wurundjeri, which, by the way, never ever existed. Wurundjeri or some name like that. They were never ever a tribe, by the way. That was a figment of the imagination of some little fake, not unlike Bruce Pascoe, of the 1800s. But all of those signs have cost us money. And what do? The whole idea of those signs is to try and constantly tell you that you're on stolen land. And the idea of telling you you're on stolen land is to cause division in our country. It's a form of sedition, and it's actively being done by the public service, who are the Labor Party. There's something to think about. Really, my view is that no person who is employed by the government can be allowed to be a member of a union. End of story. You don't like that? Bugger off and join private enterprise. But don't sit in here wanting the public to pay for you and you be a member of the union, because the union and the Labor Party are one and the same. And we cannot afford to have a political party, one political party, running our country, because effectively that's what we've got and what we've had for a long, long while.
Especially with the disarray that the Liberal Party is in at the moment. We're staring down the barrel of a Labor Party government for quite a while. But look, let's go back to one of these reckless Labor Party points of history. And this is a question from Dilemmas. He says, in the Colonel's personal opinion, did the CIA have anything to do with Whitlam's dismissal?
Absolutely not. Now, this is an interesting thing. Coming back to my childhood, I went to Dinmore Primary School. Consisted of around about 200 people. There were 2 classes per teacher. A teacher looked after 2 classes. The education, by the way, was absolutely excellent. I was just so lucky to be at that school. And later, I was close to the top of the class, and my mother thought I was a little fish, a big fish in a little pond. So she sent me to Silkstone Primary School, where there were 1,500 odd students, and that too was fantastic. But coming back to where I was heading, we were taught civics, and we were taught that if government could not pass the supply bill, it did not have the confidence of the parliament, and that had started since Charles II. Charles I got his head cut off, by the way. Charles II, if the government of the day could not pass supply, it no longer had the confidence of the Parliament, and therefore the King was obliged, in this case the Governor General, was obliged to dissolve the Parliament and put the matter to the people. The CIA had absolutely nothing to do with that. Kerr was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. And by the way, there was a bit of a race on because Whitlam wanted to fire Kerr. If Whitlam had known what was really going to happen, he would have tried to fire Kerr, which underlines why our Governor General has to be elected. We cannot trust the politicians. I'd have to say the majority of them are not people to be trusted. So no, the CIA had nothing to do with that. But Whitlam had a lot to do with it, by the way, because you may remember that he came out on the steps of what is now the old Parliament House and said, well, may you say God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General. The moment he did that, he sealed his fate. He should have walked out on those stairs if he wasn't such an arrogant prick and said, my dear friend, Sir John Kerr, the person that I selected to be the Governor General, has been put in this dreadful position by that scumbag Fraser. And I'm asking the Australian people to resolutely say that they will not tolerate such nefarious behaviour by re-electing my government to the position it rightfully belongs. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now, that's what a politician, a person with a brain would do. Whitlam did not have that. He was an egotistical scumbag.
And see, this is the thing about the fabricated history. I mean, we're all told that the Governor General turfed out Whitlam and got rid of him, but all he did was dissolve the Parliament and take it to an election. It was the Australian people that turfed out Whitlam in a landslide, and they did it again in the next election.
If Whitlam had played his cards, he would have greatly improved his chances of being. I'm not saying he would have been re-elected, but certainly doing what he did just about turned off 60%, if we go by the voice of the Australian population. They said, this guy is dangerous. And they knew about Khemlani, where he was planning on trying to raise $8 billion, which in those days was a lot of money, to run a government without supply. That's the sort of stuff that you can get your head chopped off in another era. And that's what they were up to. Plus we had Jim Cairns, bedding Junie Morosi, and we had a whole range of all sorts of idiocy happening. That was a very dark day.
How does
We've
that
got
period,
it by the way?
How does that period compare to now? I mean, a lot of I know my grandparents used to talk about the Whitlam years, and they used to say that was a period that really ruined Australia and set us on the wrong course. And it wasn't until John Howard came along that, in their view, Australia got back on track.
Yep.
In your view, looking over, the country from that period, what were the highs and the lows, and are we in a similar low?
Look, the first thing, we come back to the incompetence of government, regardless of the political party. I had the good fortune to go to RMC when the Crown Prince of Thailand was going there. And I was the captain of the second soccer, and he was a member of my team. And our coach was Chiang Samarang, who had been an Olympic soccer player and was the prince's bodyguard. So I said to Sammy, I said, Sammy, would you guys like to come home with me on the August holidays, because you've got nowhere to go, and you could come home and see what Australia's really like. Now, I didn't really have a family. My dad was living alone, but we traveled along in a Volkswagen 1500 Volkswagen, which was owned by Sammy, and we travelled up to Queensland, and I got to know the Crown Prince very well. I also got to know the bodyguard very well, and it became so apparent to me that I didn't know really anything about Southeast Asia or what Thailand was like or anything. I'm so totally, thoroughly ignorant, and so were our politicians. All we needed to do, as all our politicians needed to do, was to make contact with the Vietnamese and say, look, what's the problem here? And Ho Chi Minh, who was not a communist, truly, would have said, look, the problem is that we have been separated for ages, and I want to unify this country. We're all Vietnamese. I want us to be one nation. Can you help me? And that we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War. It was a totally unnecessary war if Australian politicians had got off their arse in their area of interest and spoken to the Vietnamese. And that's what came home to me when I was dealing with, the Thais. I'm thinking, God, I'm so ignorant. I don't know anything about Thailand. I don't know anything about the King of Thailand. By the way, the King of Thailand didn't want me to get married. He said, look, I'd like you to come to Thailand. I'd developed this rifle. The King of Thailand had developed a feed mechanism for 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns firing out of helicopters. He was an engineer as well, and he'd been following my exploits, building my rifle and silencer. And he said, look, don't marry this girl. Come to Thailand, and I promise you, you'll have a very good career here. Which my wife to be wasn't so keen on that, but I said, no, look, I'm sorry. I've given my word, and my word's my bond. I'm going to marry this girl. And I did. So, yeah. So there's some interesting stories for you in itself.
But mate, you completely ignored the question.
Yeah.
You started talking about Thailand. I'm asking you about Australia.
Well, I'm telling you that we get ourselves into a whole lot of mess, and we got ourselves into Vietnam at that time through ignorance, through the fact that our politicians did not do what they're supposed to do, which is find out what the hell's going on and work out a way of avoiding us getting embroiled in a war. All the way with LBJ. That shouldn't have happened.
Now, to finish up, you're talking about all these experiences that you had. You just talked about this relationship that you had with the Thai king. I mean, I'm sure you've met a lot of incredible people along the way, whether it be in the military or in science or the medical field. I know you have a lot of contacts with some really great doctors. And also your time in the National Party as well. Who are some of the most influential people that you've met over your lifespan?
Oh, that's a hard question, because there are a lot of I've been lucky to meet so many successful people. In the military, it's hard to I'd say General Gratian, Peter Gratian, is somebody who had quite an effect on me. And he was responsible for setting, I caused the helicopters, the situation where the helicopters were all taken from the RAF and put into the army. But it was Peter Gratian who actually followed through on that. I wrote this thing called the Aerial Fire Support Platform, which advocated that it was inappropriate to have rotary wing aircraft in the RAF. We needed them in the army. The chief of the air staff rang up Peter Gratian one Friday afternoon and said, look, I think we ought to revisit this whole question of rotary wing aircraft. What the chief of the Air Force wanted was the Kiowas and so forth, which the army operated. He wanted them in the Air Force. And Peter Gratian said, yes, I agree, and then hung up the phone. I've been in contact with a guy called Bill Cruz, and he's a terrific guy as well. They say there's just the list is endless. Bill was a full colonel at that stage, and who was shadowing Phil Gibbs. What's his name? The fellow who did, it'll come to me in a moment, Paul Dibbs. Paul Dibbs wrote the white paper for Beasley. And so Bill said to me, listen, Kev, get that paper across to me and I'll give it to Paul Dibb. And he did. And Paul Dibb said, yes, look, I'm convinced the helicopter should be a part of the army. And that's exactly what happened. So there's, two areas. Colonel John Fawkes, who was my first commanding officer, also was an exceptional person. Another fellow, Bob Miller, who was the director of Ramey, the terrific guy, and influential in my life. The Campbells, then Major Jim Campbell, he won a DFC in Vietnam, flying into a minefield to rescue injured soldiers, and his helicopter, I think, is still hung in the War Memorial Museum. he and his wife helped me with getting the commercialization of that physiotherapy table that I made for their little girl who suffered from cystic fibrosis. It just goes on and on, mate. I've been very lucky to meet very talented people. I have these ideas, and those ideas would never have happened unless I met, talented people. And by the way, Steve, you're one of them. Congratulations. Welcome to the club. This Australians for Better Government wouldn't be happening were it not for you. Yeah, sure. I've sort of sowed seeds with a whole lot of ideas, but you're the guy who said, listen, I think there's something to this. I'm going to make it happen. And you did. Thank you very much.
Well, you're too kind, Kevin. And I think we've just scratched the surface today, talking about your life and your achievements and your experiences and everything that's come along. From, I guess, really humble beginnings. It was humble for a lot of Australians during that period, and they were tough people. They call it the greatest generation. That turn of the century, going through the great wars and the depression, and then also the aftermath of the wars. I mean, it was a incredible time, and the stoic, tough people that managed to build a great civilization out of the ashes of the destruction of the world wars is something really incredible. And it's really frustrating now when we have this black armband history of everything that's come before us, where we should be looking back with great pride at our ancestry here in this country and also around the world as well. I mean, a lot of countries achieved a lot from out of the wars, and also, I mean, I think humanity itself has achieved a lot coming from the dirt. I mean, we're put on this planet with nothing, and we've built so much since then as a species. I mean, we need to look at our species with a lot of pride and a lot of admiration and learn, from that to even go beyond into the stars. We have so much potential as a species, and we're constantly battling with each other and looking down on ourselves and feeling ashamed of what has come before. But I guess it's one of those things. If you look for the positives, you'll find it, and if you look for the negatives, you'll find it. It's how you frame your outlook on life. And I think, looking back at your life, I mean, it's really been incredible. And I'm sure there's things that you've forgotten about that you've achieved that you.
There's a lot, mate. On my website, you can find all of the various things that I've stuck. Well, that's only, by the way, that's only about 1/3 of the things that I've developed. I've often thought of going back to my website and putting up other stuff. If you go to the past projects and then current projects, you can see the sort of inventions and developments I've been involved in. But I've got to stress all the time, and I do say this on my page, most of what you see there would never have happened without the help of other people. It's not all Kevin Loughrey. It's, there are a whole lot of other people who deserve credit for what they did. There's Andy Witt. He's a fitter and turner. He played a big role in helping me build that rifle, and also even training me in how to use machinery better. I was already qualified in fitting and turning when I went to Three Base Workshop. But Andy, who was Polish, by the way, obviously Polish Australian, but he had a Polish accent, and he helped me build that rifle.
No, it really is incredible, mate. If you do want to check all that out, kevinloughrey.com.au, and check out Kevin's website, and it's really like an encyclopedia going through that website, mate. There's a lot of
it keeps you busy, that's for sure.
Well, look, mate, we've got a comment here from Graham just to finish up. He says Australia has produced many great people, most of which have since been suppressed, silenced, or forgotten. I mean, it's a really sorry state.
That's very true. That's very true.
It's very sad.
Thank you, Graham. That's a good comment.
Yeah. Well, look, mate, I've enjoyed this chat. I've enjoyed this for a host of different reasons, and I think it's given me an insight into where your path towards a lot of the proposals that you came up with for Australians for Better Government. It's put it a lot of those proposals in a better context for me, and hopefully for the audience as well, to understand the solutions that you've come up with, the basis behind that, and the reasons behind that, And I think we need to have more conversations like this to flesh some of these things out. And that's what we want to do at Australian Spirit of Government. And hopefully we can move towards these constitutional conventions that we want to have, so we can really have a platform for a lot of people to come along and have the conversations like we've just had tonight or today, really reflecting on the history of this country, where we've come from, where we're heading, and the reasons why we're in the situation that we are now, and maybe some of the solutions on how we move forward from our current situation.
And you're right that as I mentioned to you, nothing of what I've achieved could have been achieved without the help of many others who are very talented and very good. And really, the first focus we're aimed at is to improve the quality of our parliamentarians. That's why we want to reform the electoral system, because I believe just like that you and I don't have the answers to the multitude of challenges which Australia is faced with. But if we get really high quality people in Parliament, they'll work it out. And it will be enduring. It's like teach a man to fish and he'll be fed for a lifetime. So rather than giving them the answers, let's just get high quality people into our Parliament. And then the next part of this is that the tool has to be fixed. The tool is broken, and you can have a good tradesman, but give them bad tools and the work will always be substandard. We have a parliamentary structure which is a bad tool. It's one we've inherited. It's nobody's blame, nobody's fault, but nobody's to blame. It's nobody's fault. But it is a defective tool, and we need to fix that tool so that it can be wielded adroitly for great benefit for all the people of Australia. And that's what you and I are working on.
And if you're sitting on your hands and you haven't done it already, head to australiansforbetter.com and check out the website. I mean, this is our mission page where it goes through the proposals that we're putting forward. I mean, if you click on each one of these links, it will take you through to the different areas. There's reforming the Constitution, ensuring a true separation of powers, improving the quality of the vote, enshrining our freedoms and direct democracy. And there's a sixth pillar that I want to add into there when I can find the time. It's to focus on Australian pride and really having pride in this country and focusing on the great things that we've done in the society since we've been on this land. So I want to add that in as well. But please head to australiansforbetter.com and sign up to be a member. I know we do ask for a fee for that membership. It is $35, but there's a reason behind that. It's purely because we need the resources to make this movement grow. We want to be able to host events and print materials and do a whole bunch of different things, advertising. I mean, that stuff costs money. So we're not living in a fantasy world by saying that we don't need money. Well, to have these sorts of movements, we definitely do. And we don't have big backers behind us. We don't have millionaires and billionaires behind us pushing different other groups out there. We rely on the everyday Australian people. It's a grassroots movement. So that's why I say it's a grassroots movement to really reform our system of government. And thank you, Kevin, for being such a big part of it. And I know we are doing some great things behind the scenes. And if we had more time, we could do a lot more. But we're just doing what we can as everyday Australians, and hopefully striving forward as the years go on. So, mate, thanks for coming on.
It's a pleasure, Steve, always.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure to discuss this with you. And I'm always finding things out about you that I had no idea about. I didn't know about the Thai King and all that sort of thing. So all this stuff is very, very interesting. And look, if you've enjoyed this, keep up to date with everything that we're doing by heading to commandingthenarrative.com. I've been having some really great discussions lately with a variety of different people. There's a lot of great content on the Commanding the Narrative the pages, whether you follow us on Rumble or YouTube. It's all up there. You can go back and watch previous episodes, and some really great stuff. There's some people that I probably should have on again, like Dr. Peter McCullough and Professor Ian Plimer and stuff. But we've been blessed to have interviewed so many great people and so many great minds over the years. And Kevin, you're right up there. And I guess that's why I continue to have you on, to pick your brain and to hear your insights. And hopefully we can do more of these into the future.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, I'm always there to support you, mate. There's no two ways about it.
No, thanks, mate. And for everyone out there, as I say every single time, please share this far and wide, and like and subscribe and comment and all those things. And we'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.